Hello, this is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com. I'm here to talk to you about the two Boulez boxes of Bartók, the three B's, a Boulez box of Bartók. Now, Boulez was an interesting case, I think, in the history of 20th century conducting. He made quite a few recordings of his core repertoire, which was quite limited, remember. It was sort of 20th century music and very little else, starting with Mahler and working up until, sort of the 1960s or 70s. And then, he had very little interest in certainly the classical period, romantic music, and modern music that was not of his type, that is the sort of avant-garde style. So you were sort of limited to the first half of the 20th century, and I think that when it came to Bartók, he was a very persuasive conductor initially, but the thing about Boulez that was kind of interesting is that as he got older and matured and remade things, there was no improvement at all. He simply got slower. I mean, initially in the 60s, he really, he was learning his trade as a conductor. Remember, he was basically discovered by George Szell, who put him on the map as a conductor by inviting him to Cleveland. Until then, he had been sort of a regional French talent. And of course, he was in London with the BBC Symphony Orchestra, which was his first major post. And he made a lot of recordings for CBS then, and the orchestra wasn't terribly good. And we got to hear him learn the trade through recordings. And he learned it very quickly. I mean, he's a brilliant, gifted musician. There's no question about that. And the question was, what, if anything, was he going to communicate to the orchestra? By the time he got to the New York Philharmonic, he was in full cry as a conductor, and he made some really terrific Bartók discs. And here they are. You ready? The music for strings, percussion, and celesta, which I talked about with the BBC Symphony, which is not great because the orchestra is not great, and there isn't much Boulez can do about it. Also, this is one of Bartók's most expressive and in some ways disturbing works, and Boulez was not much for expression either. He never quite captures the mystery of the third movement, for example, or that sort of numb terror in the first movement, or the savagery of the second. Emotion wasn't really his thing. Form, structure, clarity, he was very good with that stuff. But then he did the Concerto for Orchestra with the New York Philharmonic, and it was a first-rate performance that for some reason Sony never got into any box before now. In fact, it was only issued on CD individually as one of those great performances of the century, newspaper print things. And then it came out as an SACD only, not a dual layer, mutually compatible thing. I don't know why it kept getting neglected. It's a great performance. It's absolutely first rate. The four pieces for orchestra were fabulous. The three village scenes are excellent. The Miraculous Mandarin is one of the great ones, bar none. Absolutely spectacular. Same thing with the Wooden Prince. And then we have a Bluebeard's Castle with the BBC Symphony again, but with Tatiana Troyanos and Sigmund Nimsgaren, who are wonderful soloists. Troyanos particularly is fabulous. Absolutely first rate. And then the Dance Suite with the New York Phil. These are terrific Bartók performances, so it's 4 excellent discs of Bartók on Sony. However, Boulez remade everything for Deutsche Grammophon. There was no reason for him to remake any of this stuff. He didn't have any change in feeling about it. There was no way. You look at somebody like Herbert Blomstedt doing Beethoven, right? And you compare his two Beethoven cycles. They're worlds apart. His conception evolved. It changed. At least it was different. Boulez had absolutely nothing further to bring to the party from what we got the first time, and I think he was simply older and perhaps not even terribly interested. I think he was by then a major name. He was making records because Deutsche Grammophon wanted to make records with Pierre Boulez. They had to find repertoire that they could possibly sell some of, and so they remade all of his Bartók, and they did more than he did for Sony. And that's where things get a little interesting, because while the Sony set is 4 discs, this thing is 8, even though most of the same music is in here except for the 3 village scenes. So what do you get in here? You get, once again, the 4 pieces for orchestra and the Concerto for Orchestra, both very good, but not as good as the New York performances. Then you get the Dance Suite, the 2 pictures, the Hungarian sketches, and the divertimento. That's mostly new stuff. Those are good performances, no question about it. You don't make comparisons in pieces like the Hungarian sketches. It's not an interesting enough work to worry about. But the dance suite is better in New York for sure. The divertimento is good, just good. It's fine. Then you have the 3 piano concertos. These are with 3 different soloists. It's Christian Zimmermann in the first. Let's see who else we have. Life Ove Ansnes in the second, and Hélène Grimaud in the third. Excellent versions, all of them. The piano concerti are very, very good and well worth hearing. No question about it. Then we have the Concerto for 2 Pianos, Percussion, and Orchestra, which is a complete waste of time, and a badly recorded performance to boot. This is a piece that never works. It should always have stayed the Sonata for 2 Pianos and Percussion. We know why Bartók did it. He did it for the money. It's not a major effort, and it's not a successful translation of the chamber work to the orchestral work. In particular, the orchestra has virtually nothing to do, and this performance doesn't sound very good either. The Violin Concerto No. 1 has Gideon Kramer in the Berlin Philharmonic. It's quite well done. And the Viola Concerto has Yuri Bashmet in the Berlin Philharmonic. It's a good performance. You can't, but again, Bartók died before it was finished. God knows how it would have turned out had he lived. I've never found the work very appealing personally. That's me personally. It just doesn't do it for me. And so the performance doesn't thrill me, although it's very good of its kind. I can't complain about it. The Violin Concerto No. 2 has Gil Shaham with the 2 Rhapsodies for violin and orchestra. Excellent, first rate, largely because Boulez is simply accompanying, and Shaham is a first-rate violinist by any standard, and these are very, very good performances of it. Bluebeard's Castle. Oh, this is a problem. You have Jesse Norman and Laszlo Polgar. I don't know exactly what the situation was. This recording was rumored. It was held up for a long, long time, supposedly because Norman wouldn't approve it. And she was right not to. This is not a very good performance on her part. I saw her do it live at the Met. It was really kind of bizarre with Sam Raimi as Bluebeard. It was that horrible production that took place in a sort of an outer space. And when, the fifth door opens, you hear the kerplooey, and the set opens up and you see that she's like in orbit and like the planet Earth or some planet is down below. It was a very silly production. And Norman was really good at that, and so was Sam Raimi, who was actually blue. He was this bald blue guy. He looked like one of the Blue Men, one of that group that does that performance art stuff. And he sort of took his clothes off as the production went on, and he got bluer and bluer until the end. You could certainly see the attraction between the two of them. Here's a performance, though, where neither soloist is at the top of their game, and Boulez sounds especially not very interested in what's going on. And then we get the Cantata Profana, which he never did before, and that's a good performance. We've got the Chicago Symphony Chorus, which is always first rate, and the Wooden Prince, which he did very well in New York, and he does well here, but again, not particularly better in any way. The Miraculous Mandarin, unquestionably the New York performance is better. The music for strings, percussion, and celesta with Chicago is better than the BBC version from a technical point of view, but hearing this performance, you realize that Boulez is just not emotionally involved in the piece. For whatever reason, it just didn't affect him in a way that allowed him to put it over as grippingly and convincingly, as it should have. So if you're going to get Boulez doing Bartók, the bottom line is get the cheap Sony set. 4 discs of Boulez doing Bartók is enough. You can get the other stuff in better performances virtually everywhere else, unless you must have the concertos. Gil Shaham is worth hearing. You might be able to get it separately. The piano concertos are worth hearing. Again, you might be able to get them separately. I wouldn't buy 8 discs of Bartók just because the name Boulez is attached. And it seems to me that is what Deutsche Grammophon was hoping when they made these things in the first place. So that's the bottom line. Boulez on Sony, the young Boulez, he had more fire in his belly, more energy in his conducting, an orchestra that was more responsive and that he'd been working with for a while, so there was something there, even though they referred to him in New York as the French Correction. They had their relationship, whatever it was. Maybe he hated each other. That's sometimes a good thing. Be that as it may, Sony is the way to go. Deutsche Grammophon, not interesting. And that is the bottom line. Keep on listening. Thank you. And if you enjoyed this little talk, do please subscribe to my YouTube channel. I appreciate your time, your attention, your consideration, your enthusiasm, your comments, all of it. Thank you all so much for joining me.